The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show. All right. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this, what was here at least a beautiful weekend. I hope you had a great weekend so far, and looking forward to a fantastic work week. Production. Tomorrow we go back to producing. Of course, I'm producing right now. So thanks, everybody, for joining, and you should all thank Adam Campbell. I don't know if he's on right now, but the show today is dedicated to Adam, who, was it about 4 or 5 days ago, contributed about $1,000, and as part of that, got to kind of name the topic or decide on the topic for a show. And I think he wants me to talk about money. We will see. He'll let me know afterwards if this turns out to be not the show he wanted. He sent me an email, but I can't say I'm completely 100% clear on what exactly he wanted to talk about. But we'll get there. We'll figure it out. And it should be a good topic, no matter what. It should be a good topic. So I am looking forward to it. In the meantime, just a few reminders before we get going. Don't forget to like the show while you're on. Don't forget to share the show. Don't forget, of course, to use Super Chat on YouTube to ask any questions. Priority will be given to questions that have to do with the topic. And, of course, priority will be given to questions with large dollar numbers next to them. So the more you want, more eager you are for your question to be answered, the more you have to contribute. So there will be, we're not egalitarians in the Yaron Brook Show. There's definitely money talks. All right. Some money. Today we're going to talk about where it comes from, kind of the evolution of it, what it represents, and what role does the government have? What role does the government have vis-a-vis money? And then, of course, we will talk about what's going on today, which is very relevant to the issue of money with massive deficit spending going on now. I might mention this later as well, but I do want to recommend one of Ayn Rand's great, brilliant essays that I think everybody should read. It's one of those must-reads from Ayn Rand, written in 1974, I think, called Egalitarianism and Inflation. Egalitarianism and Inflation. You can find the lecture online, the lecture she gave called Egalitarianism and Inflation online at the Ayn Rand Institute campus. And you can find the essay in Philosophy Who Needs It. But it is a brilliant essay relating to exactly the topic we're talking about today. And towards the end, I want to talk about a little bit about kind of maybe one of the predictions she makes in the essay towards the end of the essay that doesn't come true. Why? How did we recover from 1974 when Ayn Rand predicted real doom and gloom for the United States and for the world? So what happened that made it possible for the United States and if you will, the Western world to recover from the horrors of the 1970s and the awfulness of government policy during the time? Of course, the other brilliant essay about money that I would recommend, it's on SoundCloud, and you can link to the SoundCloud from the Ayn Rand Institute website. Ayn Rand Campus. Ayn Rand Campus has this essay on it and links to the SoundCloud audio. Also, of course, the other brilliant essay relating to money is, yes, there it is. Josh just put up a link on Facebook to the SoundCloud phenomenon. I wanted people to go to Ayn Rand Campus because then they would discover all the other great stuff that exists over there in terms of Ayn Rand material. But of course, the other one is Francisco's money speech in Atlas Shrugged, which is of course a classic. And if you've read Atlas Shrugged, that's probably one of your favorite speeches. one of the favorite sections. It's a brilliant speech. I know at the Institute we used to hand out little brochures with just the money speech in them. The money speech also appears in For the New Intellectual as kind of an essay within it. So those are the two big essays on money, although the theme of money and production and the meaning of money and production are everywhere in Ayn Rand's writings. So I encourage you to read Egalitarianism and Inflation by Ayn Rand, and of course the money speech from Atlas Shrugged. So let's kind of start at the beginning. Wind back in human history and really talk about the history of money and a lot of the idea of where money comes from, or how money evolved, or how money was created, if you will, how money was discovered as a tool. It comes from both Ayn Rand's work, but I think even Ayn Rand got much of that from the Austrian School of Economics, and here in particular, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, Menger. Menger, who was 19th century Austrian economist, was the founder of the School of Economics. There's also, of course, von Mises's book on money and credit, which is a brilliant, brilliant book to try to understand money. But we're going to try to stay not very technical here. This is ultimately not a technical audience that I have here. So I'm going to try not to be super technical with you in terms of the origins of money or how money works or how credit works. But we will get to credit, particularly government credit, and its role in what is going on right now. So let's do the history of money. So think about, human societies. What we're going to do, rather than do evolutionary psychology, we're going to do just history. I like history. Right? When men were hunter-gatherers, there was little need for money. Very little specialization, very little division of labor, always on the edge of starvation. You hunted as a tribe, as a group. Maybe there were tool builders, maybe there were weapons builders, but basically they got paid through, informal barter. You made the weapons, and when we caught the animal, and you got to participate in eating it. The women would maybe skin the animal and cook, although I don't know. There was some kind of division of labor, but it was so primitive, so backwards that you don't need money. And indeed, in hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, there is no concept of money. There is no real division of labor. There's some, because they're huge efficiencies, but it's minor, and there's so few goods, the few things, the so little that people do and produce and create, that money becomes meaningless. Really, money is really a phenomena of much more advanced society, and really the first advancement towards civilization that occurred was farming. When human beings started a farm, they settled down in one place. Now the level of specialization increased. And now success in farming required planning, required thinking on a scale that the hunter-gatherers do not need to engage in. It required thinking about seasons. It required planning for next year. It required, as Ayn Rand writes in Egalitarianism and Inflation, it requires preserving your seeds. It required production. It required planting, harvesting, consuming the harvest, but not consuming all of it so you could plant again. And indeed, that whole process of thinking long term, of saving, and of producing, the planting, the harvesting, all of that translates into what is going on today. We must think about our future. We cannot just consume. We must produce today, but we must also plan for production in the future. If we consume everything we produce, and we save nothing, then there's no future production. And to facilitate future production, we must save. Save means, what does saving means? Saving means not consuming. You save the seed, the stock seed, that you don't consume, that you use then to plant. The money you save today, for example, it's the money you don't consume. You don't consume, and you use that money either for future consumption or for future investments. And as an economy, that saving is investment in the future. So the whole idea of long-term planning, the idea of saving, the idea of production, only come around once we settle in agricultural society. Once we start having a semblance of civilization. Of course, as that civilization grows, some people become more successful, some people become less successful. The ones who are more successful tend to be the ones who save, grow production, plant more, think better about the future, are better planners, better producers, better savers. But also we start to specialize more. We start living in towns with larger communities. Human population grows. We start specializing. And specialization leads to trade. We start exchanging stuff. So somebody might be continuing to produce wheat, but somebody else might produce tools that are helpful in harvesting. And somebody else might have cattle and produce meat and milk. And suddenly we get specialization and trade. Different people producing different things. And then they trade with one another. And of course, there's still no money. So what is the basis for the trade? Well, the basis for the trade is product for product. It's barter. I have a cow. You have wheat. How much wheat does one cow buy? Or maybe I slaughtered the cow and I only sell you a piece of the meat, a piece of the cow, and get wheat in exchange. And of course, you might have tools. I would buy the tools from you by promising you X percentage of my harvest. But as specialization grows, as people produce different things, as there's more exchange, and as people need to find a way to save where they don't have something like seed that they can save, there is now a need for something to facilitate this trade to make it more efficient. Trade through barter is incredibly inefficient. Incredibly inefficient. I have to drag my cow around everywhere I go. I have to bushels of wheat. I have to take them to the marketplace. And I can only exchange so many bushels for a whole cow. I can't divide up the cow. Half a cow is not worth half as much as a live whole cow. Chickens, eggs, all of these goods and products, vegetables, fruits, the exchange rates, think about the number of exchange rates you have to go through. How many apples for a bushel of wheat versus a cow versus chicken versus eggs versus barley versus other products? It is truly becomes super complicated. So people at that point seek out something that has value, something that people want, desire, have a use for. That is easy transport, easy to divide, there's not too much of it, needs to be produced, and we use that thing to facilitate exchanges. So, for example, in colonial United States, tobacco was used as money. Everything was denominated in tobacco, in a pound of tobacco. And tobacco was shipped around in order to facilitate exchange. But tobacco is not really very good. You can't save tobacco. Tobacco goes bad, and tobacco is consumed. And when consumed, it's gone. It disappears. If you're storing your wealth in tobacco, not good. So there's kind of continuous search for something that can serve effectively as what we call a medium of exchange, a tool of exchange. And importantly, this tool of exchange must also be, and this is often ignored when talking about money, a tool for saving, a way to preserve our unconsumed production for the future, to be invested or to be consumed in the future. Something that won't spoil. Something that will still have value in the future because people will still want it in the future. Something that I can easily keep track of. Now, again, think about this. What's saved is what I didn't consume. Even in a society of money, what's saved is that which I produced, which I didn't consume. Let's say I make shoes. And let's say I make 20 pairs of shoes. And I exchange 15 of them for the food and lodging and my needs right now so that I can survive. The 5 I don't exchange for those things are the 5 I save. That's my saving. And in the future, I can exchange that 5 pairs of shoes that I didn't consume for, I don't know, more leather, more product to make more shoes. Again, you saving is that which you produced, which you have not yet consumed. So human beings all over the planet, once they reach a certain level of sophistication in terms of trade, once they reach a certain level of barter, they seek out money. They seek out a means by which to make trade more efficient through a medium of exchange, and a means by which they can save for future production and future consumption. Most societies evolved around something like gold or silver. And the reason gold or silver worked so well is because it was valued for its beauty, for the ability to make jewelry from it, for the ability to mold it into a variety of different shapes. It was valued because it was relatively rare. It wasn't like sand just lying around everywhere. So the supply of this stuff couldn't just increase spontaneously. It was valued because it didn't spoil, it didn't deteriorate. It was easy to preserve, it was easy to keep. So money is a creation of the marketplace. Money is a creation of the marketplace to facilitate more efficient trade, to facilitate exchange, and to facilitate savings. And of course, we know that gold was dominant because gold has all these wonderful characteristics that make it possible for it to exist. And that's why it was a commodity with a base value, with a fundamental value at its core. Something people actually wanted for its own sake. So if you got stuck with it, it had some value to you. But once enough people started exchanging this, it became money. It became the money. The key here is that all money does, right? All money does is that money makes the trade possible. I still have to manufacture the shoes. And I still need food and shelter and all the things I've always needed. What I can do now to make the transactions more efficient is, instead of figuring out how many shoes I could get to get food, how many shoes I'd have to give my landlord to get rent, to get lodging, how many shoes I'd have to give to get clothing, I can now exchange all my shoes for money. I can put aside the amount that I want to save for future investment for production. And I can take the rest and I can go and buy the specific food I want, whether the person I'm buying it from wants shoes or not. I can take the money and go buy lodging. I can buy clothing with that money. But all the money is a representation of the stuff that I produced. There is no money without production. Even the person who finds the gold, who refines the gold, who creates the gold qua money, has to produce. He has to mine and refine and produce the money. So even the money itself has to be produced. So money is a representative of production. It does not come out of nowhere. It is not just created out of thin air. And to have money means to have produced. Now, this is true in the modern context, or in any context, of a salaried employee as well as an entrepreneur, as a business owner. Instead of you coming to work for me and me paying you in chickens and eggs and half a cow and some bushels of wheat and maybe some vegetables on the side, I pay you for what you create, for what you produce for me, for your production in money. The money you have represents what you produced for me as your employer. Money is a representation of production. Only through production can you get money. Now, it's true that you can steal money, or you can get the government to steal money for you. That is, you can not produce and get money. But that money has to come from somebody who did produce. That money can only exist because somebody produced it and it was taken away from them. Okay, I will get to all the Super Chat questions, I promise. I'm copying them down. So money is production, at least in its original form, in a gold. When money is gold, money is production. Money represents everything about production. There is no money in an economy that is not matched up with some production. And note, and this is important because we'll keep coming back to this, particularly when we try to understand the fiat money world and the kind of government debt world. This is really important. That money facilitates saving. And saving facilitates production. And production is where money comes from. And that production and the savings is that production that you didn't consume. Again, it's constant spiral. Without saving, there is no future production. Production declines. Money declines. Money becomes useless because there's no point in money if there's nothing to buy with it, if there's money to get from it. I don't know, somebody's asking if this is written out. I don't know. what I'm doing is unscripted, so I don't know if that's the question. Production, money, saving leads to more production. Money, saving leads to more production. Of course, in the middle is consumption. But note, in a gold-based economy, you cannot consume unless you produced or unless you somehow got money from somebody who did produce. Production is primary. Production is primary. Production results, so I produce something, I sell it, I get the money. Some of that money I use to consume, some of that money I save, which allows me to do more production, which allows me to consume more, which allows me to save more, and on we go. And in that sense, your profit is, as a business owner, is where your consumption and savings come from. All right, I know everybody wants to get a Bitcoin, but Bitcoin's going to be at the end, at the very, very end. So cool it. Cool it. We will get to it. Money is not a legal contract. Money has nothing to do with legal contracts. Money is that which we have chosen to be the medium of exchange. There's no contract there. You don't have to accept my money. You can demand a different form of payment in a free market. You can demand a different form of payment. You can say, I don't take gold. All right, we are. Let me just see. All right, Adam's here. All right. Adam says this is perfect. He's adding $20 to the $1,000 he already gave. And the $20 is to not spend too much time on Bitcoin. I promise I won't. All right, so consumption is something you do after you produce. The welfare state creates a whole class of people who can consume without producing. But it is still true, absolutely true, that in order for them to consume, somebody had to produce. Their production, some of that production got stolen from them and given to the welfare recipient, who can then use it for consumption. There is no welfare. There is no redistribution of wealth. There is no consumption without producers. Again, we'll get to what the government does when it prints money and just creates it out of thin air. That's how it all works under a gold standard, when money is gold. And again, we're avoiding complexities. Now think about what credit is in such a world. I'm young with an idea for a new business to produce something new. You might be somebody older who's produced a lot, saved a lot, and has accumulated some savings. I come to you with a business idea. You say, okay, that sounds reasonable. You seem like a good guy. I'll lend you this money, credit, and I expect you to return it under these terms. With interest. Interest as compensation for risk, as compensation for the fact that my ability to use that money is, I have to wait years, months, until I get to use the money again. I could have used it to consume. I could have invested in somebody else. So there's what's called an opportunity cost. I don't like that terminology, but an opportunity cost. I could have used the money for something else. So it's risk plus the opportunity that I lose by giving it to you. And credit is an IOU that says, I will take this money, use it to produce something, and pay you back from that production. The only way I can pay you back is from production. That's the only way to get money. It's the only way to get stuff to be able to pay back my debts. Now imagine somebody who comes to you as a saver and says, and asks for a loan, and you give them the loan under the assumption they're going to spend it on a business and create and produce and build stuff. But no, they take that money and they consume it. So it's gone. And then they come back to you and they say, I need another loan. And let's say for some bizarre reason, you don't ask them what happened to the other loan. Why aren't you paying me back that? They say, no, this time I've got a better idea. This time it'll work. And maybe they even use the new loan, the money from the new loan, to pay you back the old loan. But that's going to run out, and they're going to need a third loan to pay back the second loan and a fourth loan to pay back the third loan. What do we call that? There's a name for that when you do it on a large enough scale. What do we call that? We call that a pyramid scheme. Right? But note that what that does is deplete your saving without creating any production. Just goes into consumption. And production is crushed. And if you do that on a large enough scale, then there will be no production in the future. And with no production in the future, there's no wealth, there's no money. Everybody becomes poor. Everybody loses. So think about how a Ponzi scheme works to deplete savings and therefore deplete investment and therefore deplete production and thus make us all much poorer than we would otherwise be. So credit is crucial because credit facilitates new production. It facilitates new ideas. It makes it possible for people who are too young or too new to be able to build businesses and produce on scale. Credit is an essential part of a marketplace, of a free marketplace. And it's the way in which new ideas get manifest. And again, the wealth grows. And how does wealth grow? What is wealth? What does it mean that we've created wealth? It means we're producing more. And it could be producing better. But wealth is just a representation, a mirror image of production. Because you cannot get wealth. There is no wealth. There is no money in that sense, in a sense of gold, in a sense of something real, without production. You can't get it otherwise. And indeed, you can imagine here how banks come about, to store a gold, and paper money comes about as basically paper money is the IOUs that the banks issue you when you store the gold with them. So you store the gold with a bank, X number of ounces. They issue IOUs against those ounces. Then you use those IOUs to buy stuff. And basically the IOU is transferred into the person who now holds the piece of paper. And they can go to the banker and get the money from them. And initially all banks did was store the gold. But then banks figured out that they had this store of gold with them. And they could now make loans on this gold. Because the fact is that people didn't come and demand all the gold come out all at the same time. And sometimes they could even have contracts with people that said, you're storing this gold for 2 years and you can't get the money out before then. So they knew they had it for 2 years. So they could then lend it out. They could issue IOUs against the store money for 2 years, knowing that that store wouldn't be depleted. So you can see how credit was created on a much bigger scale. Because an entrepreneur coming to another individual can only get X amount. But an entrepreneur going to a bank or going to an institution that aggregates can now get much larger loans, now start much bigger businesses, much bigger ventures, much bigger expansions of businesses. Now, Now there's opportunity to build real industries, create massive quantities of wealth. And that's what happened. That's what capitalism does. And all capitalism needed to have this happen was the institutionalization of the protection of property rights, contract law, and the recognition that it was okay for people to use their mind in pursuit of their own happiness. So capitalism is a creation of the late 18th century. It is a creation of the Declaration of Independence, if you will. The mentality, the ideas behind the Declaration of Independence. Go out there. You have a right to your life, liberty, property. Go out there, pursue happiness. And how do you pursue happiness? By producing. You've got to produce. We produce, we save, we invest, we produce even more, we save, we invest. And in the middle, we consume because consumption is necessary for life. We have to consume. Consumption is what keeps us alive. But if we're smart, we only consume up to a point and we always save. Now let's introduce government into this equation. Government is that borrower who doesn't produce anything. So here's what's important to note about government. Government doesn't produce. Government doesn't produce anything. They don't make shoes. They don't make anything. When they try to make stuff, it's by, driving out of business people who legitimately are making it. Governments don't produce. The only way government can get money is by taking it from those who do produce. And in the gold standard, the only way they could get money was by taxing you. Now, they could also borrow money, issue credit. But note that credit is not then used for production. That credit is like the Ponzi scheme from earlier. It's used for consumption. And the only way they can pay you back for the loan they took from you is by taxing you to pay yourself back. So how does government get money to pay back its debt? By taxing the people who lent them the money to begin with. So government debt is basically just expropriating your money, assuming you're the one buying it. But even if you're not the one who's buying this debt, right, buying this IOU, providing the government with the money, because whether you buy it or not, you're going to be taxed in order to pay it back. And in a gold standard, in an economy until the U.S. economy, until the early 1930s, until FDR, or really until the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1914. Money, government could only borrow money up to a point where they thought they could tax to pay back those debts. And of course, people understood that the government could only pay back the debts by taxing, and therefore they were very weary of government taking on a lot of debt. And debt was very much controlled. I mean, short of wars, government debt was very, very, very controlled during the first 150 years of American history. For exactly this reason. Because, the only way to pay it back is by taxing you. Why would you buy the government bonds to begin with if you knew that in order to pay it back, they would have to take your money so that you could get paid back for it? Government doesn't produce anything. It doesn't create anything. It doesn't grow the wheat. It doesn't build the shoes. It doesn't make computers. It doesn't make stuff. It only spends. It steals from one person and gives to another. It consumes. Now, some of what government does is necessary for production to happen. The rule of law, police, military, all of that is legitimate and needs to happen and needs to be funded. And rational people would be happy to fund a government that did only those things. But all those things are still consumption. They're not production. It's consumption that makes production possible by creating a secure rule of law system. But it's not it's of itself creating money. So notice that how a gold standard, in a sense, kept the government honest. It kept the government honest in a sense that everybody understood how debt was repaid. Everybody understood what government debt was, and that the only way it could be repaid is through taxation. And citizens wouldn't buy the debt if it got out of hand, because they knew that that would just mean that in the future their taxes would go through the roof. And note, and this is important, that the more government borrows, the more it has to tax in the future, the less savings people have. Because in the future, instead of saving the money, they have to pay it in taxes. The less savings people have, what happens then? The less production there is, the less innovation there is, the less creation there is, the less wealth creation there is. So government borrowing and government tax is anti-growth, anti-production, because it is anti-saving and investment. Indeed, it is a penalty on saving and investment. Well, it's right. The more government taxes, the less saving we have, the less investment is made, the less production happens, the less wealth we all have. But the same thing is true of credit. The more government borrows, who's it borrowing for? It's borrowing from us. It's borrowing our savings, our investments. The more it gets, it consumes. And it's not that it invests that into production. It invests it into, it uses it for consumption, and it's gone. And then to pay it back, I'm repeating myself, I know, it has to take more of our savings to pay us back. And of course, there are a bunch of bureaucrats in the middle who get paid for all of this. Now note that even when you do credit, like consumer credit, when you take out a loan to buy a car, the bank is not lending to you as a consumer, even though it's a car loan. The bank is lending to you as a producer. The bank knows that the only way you can pay back the loan is by producing, is by working. And the car might be collateral, but what they're relying on is your work, it's your production. The same with a house, the same with any consumer loan. The only type of credit that exists out there is credit on production. That's why they want to see your tax returns. That's why they want to know how much money you make. That's why there are credit scores out there that are related to your income and how stable the income is and where it comes from. And that you don't have so much credit that you can't pay it back because you're not producing enough. But the more you produce, the more credit you can take on. So all credit, all lending, except to the government, is based on production. I will promise, I will explain why fractional reserve banking is not fraud. It's not fraud because the basic, I'll explain it in more detail, because the basic is, it's not a secret. If I told you that when you deposit money in my bank, that whenever you wanted it, on the spot, I would give it back to you, then when I couldn't give it back to you, it would be fraud. But if you look at every checking account contract that you ever signed, it says that for the most part, you can get your money whenever you want. But there are going to be times when the bank will withhold payment from you for a period, and you can only get it after that period. So it's all out in the open. It's a contract that you sign. You don't have to put the money in the bank. And in a free market, there would be fractional reserve banking and there would be non-fractional reserve banking, and you could choose which banks to go in. Fraud can only exist if somebody's lying, but nobody's lying here. It's all out in the open. It's all evident. The Austrians who claim it's fraud don't understand contracts. It's a contract. It's just a contract. It's a contract you might not like. It's a contract that some Austrian economists think is a bad contract economically because it creates economic problems, but it's a contract. And as such, it's a contract that spells out exactly what happens. So it's not fraud unless the contract is deceiving you in some way, and it's not. Read the contract. No, that's true. True under gold as well. You deposit your gold in the bank, and the bank says most of the time you can get it on demand. But there are going to be times when you won't be able to get it on demand. At our discretion, not at your discretion, at our discretion. If you want to put the money in the bank, these are the terms. If you don't, you can go put it in another bank. That's fine. And that's exactly how fractional reserve banking has always worked, and it's never been fraud. And it's fine. And if you really want to understand this more thoroughly, you can read George Selgin and Larry White have written a lot about fractional reserve banking and its impact. All right. Now, all of this, everything we've talked about, is in the context of gold as money, or something like gold. It doesn't have to be gold. Every society has to come up with something, and society generally has come up with gold because it just fits. It's just the best material out there in the natural world that fits all the requirements of good money. It's not a random. It's not subjective. It's not arbitrary. It's objectively the best. And people have tried all kinds of things, stones and rocks and corals and shells and as we said, tobacco, all kinds of things. But gold actually works the best, and that's why we evolved towards gold. In 1932, FDR took us off the gold standard. Well, it was 33, because that's when he came into office. And basically made it illegal for the United States citizens to own gold. And now, money was not linked to gold anymore. Money now was what the government determined it to be. Money now was not just a symbol of production. Money now was a medium of exchange because the government said it was a medium of exchange, and because the government only took that money as taxes. Dollars became delinked from anything. For a period from 1944 until 1970, I think it was 1 or 2, we are in a kind of a pseudo gold standard where you couldn't exchange your dollars for gold. But the Fed tried to only print dollars based on how much gold it had in its vaults. But foreign governments that had dollars could exchange their dollars for gold. And that kind of worked as long as the government didn't cheat. But during the 1960s, because of welfare and the war on poverty and Medicare and Medicaid and the Vietnam War, government started spending money like crazy. And the Federal Reserve stopped printing money just based on how much gold it has and just started printing money. And the government just started borrowing money. And it got to the point where the dollar just, there wasn't enough gold in the United States to cover all the dollars that were out there. And certain foreign governments, and particularly the French under Charles de Gaulle, said, wait a minute, we're holding these dollars. It says that they're exchangeable to gold, but there's not enough gold in the U.S. to exchange them. So I don't want to hold these dollars anymore. I'd rather have the gold. And what started happening in the late 1960s, early 1970s, is that France started sending the dollars to the Federal Reserve and demanding that they get gold, actual gold bars, and ships would sail to France, providing them with these gold bars. And other countries started to look at this and maybe we should do it too. And it was a huge sucking sound of all the gold leaving the United States and all the dollars flowing in. To the point where Richard Nixon in the early 1970s basically said, oh, wait a minute, we can't have this anymore. And he basically said, no more. Dollars are not exchangeable into gold by anybody. U.S. citizens, foreign governments, anybody. We're just not on a gold standard anymore. The dollar is whatever it is. And gold is whatever. And the Federal Reserve, you issue gold, you issue currency based on, ultimately it evolved into two standards. No inflation, so prices keep down, and the whole issue of inflation is complicated. Prices kept down, and unemployment stays low. Those are the mandates, still the mandates that the Federal Reserve has to this day. Low price inflation measured by CPI and low unemployment. That is what the Fed is supposed to do, and it's supposed to figure out how much money to print, how much money to put out there into the economy in order to keep these two low. Notice what that does. What that does is completely de-link money from production. Money now is no longer a feature of production. Money now is created literally out of thin air. It's created by government whenever it wants. Now, what happens in a gold standard when suddenly there's an influx of money? Let's say some gold miner discovers a new source of gold, and suddenly there's a one-time shock, all this new gold showing up in the economy. What happens? Well, the amount of stuff being created, the amount of production being created hasn't changed. It's just the amount of money has increased. The amount of gold is increased. So what would happen to prices under a situation like that? The prices for consumption, the prices for assets, they would go up. Why would they go up? It's simple. There's more money now, same number of goods. That money is now bidding for the same number of goods. There's more of the money, it bids it up. So prices go up. Now, this is the thing. Prices don't go up uniformly. Not all prices go up. Let's say the people who mine the gold and show up in town with bags of gold, let's say they're not interested, they're interested in some products more than they are interested in other products. Well, they will bid up the price of some products and not of others. Let's say they want to buy homes. They decide that's their focus. Well, the first price that go up are the prices of homes because they bid them up. Only then does the money start circulating throughout the economy and slowly bid up the prices of everything else. But prices don't automatically, immediately, instantaneously all adjust. Inflation, which is the increase in the money supply, affects different industries, different places, in different times, and in different ways. The same is true when the Federal Reserve prints money. Where does that money go? Remember, it's not representative of any production. It's not even representative of any particular effort, like the miners exerted by producing this gold. They actually produce something, gold. Here, there's nothing. It's just a flip of a switch. It's an electronic creation. Where does this money go? Well, it depends. It depends how they distribute it. For example, if they use it to buy bonds, then the bond owners are the first people to get the money, and they'll bid up the price of bonds, which lowers interest rates. It's how the Fed manipulates interest rates. And that money now will flow into the economy and cause some prices to go up and other prices not to, in various ways in various places, depending on people's priorities and what they're buying at this moment with this money. And indeed, when we went off the gold standard in the 1970s, what we got is a huge boost in inflation. Prices went up. Prices went up across the board. And for 10, 15 years, well, 12 years, we had something called stagflation. We had economic stagnation and rising prices. And we had more and more and more government debt financed by taking our savings. So less and less invested in production, less and less invested in business, less and less economic growth. That's the stagnation. Stagnation is caused by government sucking our savings out and spending them. I mean, Jimmy Carter happened to be president, but it wasn't relevant who was president. What was relevant is what the Federal Reserve was doing. And what was relevant was how much money government was spending. What was relevant was how much they were taxing the American people and borrowing from the American people. And remember, borrowing is like taxing because it takes money from your savings that would have gone to invest in productive activity. Instead, it's going for government consumption. So the more government debt you have, the more taxes you tax, either in the present or the future, the less production there is, because the less savings there is, which means less investment there is. And in 1974, Ayn Rand was very pessimistic. In 1984, Ayn Rand believed that the United States was going to collapse, that the world indeed was going to collapse, that the United States government was spending like there was no tomorrow, that debt was going through the roof, inflation was out of control because they were just printing money, they were just creating it, and that basically, and as a consequence of all that, there was no investment, there was very little savings, we weren't saving the seeds for the next season, so there was no increase in production. And indeed, if you look at the United States, economic growth was flat. It's just a dark period. Other countries were doing better than us, Japan, for example. And she believed we were on the verge of collapse. So one interesting question, that what happened, right? What happened between 1974 and today that allowed us to keep growing, for the economy to survive? And that's an interesting question, and you won't like the answer. Many of you won't like the answer. Many of you won't like the answer. But it also raises the question of where are we today? And let me talk about where we are today, and then I'll say something about how we got here. Certainly since 9/11, the United States government has been spending like there's no tomorrow, borrowing huge amounts of money. In other words, sucking savings and investment out of the U.S. economy. We've had a financial crisis. We now have a lockdown crisis. But in between, while we have not had inflation, and we can talk about why we haven't had inflation, what we have had is to a large extent stagnation. The economy has grown very little over the last 15 years. Average economic growth rates are around 2%. Maybe less if you count the recessions, the Great Recession, and the recession after 9/11. So we've had mounting debt. We've had meager economic growth. Massive, mounting is too weak of a word, massive quantities of debt. The stock market has gone through the roof. The bond market has gone through the roof. Interest rates are basically at zero. How does that all play out? Well, partially, there's no inflation because much of the money has gone into financial markets and assets like real estate and other assets. Partially, there's been no inflation because the demand for investment is very low. New business creation in the United States, in the U.S. economy, over the last 20 years has been declining significantly. Business creation post-financial crisis has been declining, and Trump didn't change that. Business creation under Trump was meager, pathetic. So demands for loans, business expansion has been meager. So there's been very little demand for loans. So banks tend to sit in our savings. Instead of using the savings, and in this case, the newly created money, for investment and it flowing into the economy and thus ultimately creating the inflation that we'd expect, the money just sits. It sits on the balance sheet of the banks in the form of bank reserves, but it just sits there. Partially because the banks are too afraid to lend, and they don't care anyway because they're today government-regulated utilities. And partially because there's just a low demand for loans. To the extent that Americans are borrowing money, they're borrowing it to consume, not to produce. So personal debt has been increasing. Corporate debt has been increasing. And corporate debt makes complete sense to increase because interest rates have been so low. And interest rates are so low because the Federal Reserve constantly keeps buying bonds and sending dollars into the economy. So we're in right now, much more so than in 1974, particularly with the $3.7 trillion stimulus that we already have had. We are spending far more money. We are printing far more money. We're investing far less. We're saving far less. We're producing in proportion far less. If in 1974 you were pessimistic about the U.S. economy, there's plenty of reasons to be super pessimistic today. Now, why didn't things turn out worse? Why are we still standing? Why is there still production? Why have we survived the last, 45 years? I'd say there are two reasons. Two reasons. The first is that starting actually with Jimmy Carter in the mid-1970s, actually with Gerald Ford, continuing with Jimmy Carter, and then continuing with Reagan, the federal government did a lot of deregulation, a lot of getting out of the way of businessmen. And by the way, what destroys production, it's not just taxes and debt which take away investment and savings, or savings that become investment. But what also destroyed production is regulations and controls. And over that period, we reduced significantly regulations and controls. Under Reagan, at least we, for a little bit, rationalized our tax system, so it provided less perverse incentives. Although lowering taxes and increasing borrowing is not good economic policy. Not good economic policy. So during the mid to late 1970s and through the 1980s and really through Bill Clinton's era, we basically deregulated, to some extent at least. We held back on government spending. We held back, to some extent at least, on government borrowing. Indeed, the last couple of years of Bill Clinton's presidency, we actually ran a surplus. The government actually brought in more money than it spent, so it had no net new borrowing. So that's reason number one, that we managed to get out of it. Indeed, all of that went to hell once George Bush was elected, particularly after 9/11, and certainly Obama and Trump have made all of that worse. Trump has made it balanced out the massive amounts of spending with some deregulation. So at least Trump balanced out a little bit. But the spending continued at insane levels, and some regulation actually increased under Trump. So that's cause number one. It was the massive deregulation that was happening. It wasn't even that evident in the mid-1970s. Only looking back, you could see it happening, particularly under Jimmy Carter, surprisingly. Did a lot of very, very big deregulatory bills, and not the kind of deregulation that Trump is doing, which is mainly at the agency level. Under Jimmy Carter, they actually passed bills in Congress that deregulated whole industries. Quite spectacular what was done back then, bipartisan fashion. But the second thing that has saved the United States, and not just the United States, saved Europe, is Asia. Asia, China, the tigers, and the rest of Asia. Why? Because since the 1970s, the United States has not been saving. We don't save. We consume. And our government sucks up all of our savings in taxes and in debt, and we are net negative savers. Then how did we get Silicon Valley, and how did we get production, and how did we continue to grow and continue to be, to some extent, successful? It's because of globalization and because of the freeing up of Asia. First the Asian tigers, then China. It's the fact that those markets were freed up and the fact that Asians are big savers. And what did they do with their saving? And by the way, they're savers because they are, what do you have to do before you save? You have to produce. And they started producing, manufacturing, building, making stuff, and selling it. Primarily to us. We're consumers. And then putting their savings aside. And what did they do with that savings? Well, they invested it in the United States. They sent it over here. Partially because they held dollars, because that's what happens when you sell to Americans. They pay you with dollars. And they had to do something with those dollars, so they sent them over here in the form of saving, in the form of investment. And in some cases, in the form of being the suckers who bought our debt. That was true of Japan in the 1970s and 80s. And it's true of China in the 1990s and 2000s. They also started to produce large quantities of stuff far cheaper than what we had. So that we could then spend less on consumption. And even though we weren't inclined to save, we were saving de facto because we were spending less money on what we consumed made in China, so we could spend more money on other things that we consumed. But the massive saving boom in Asia, which is a consequence of the massive production boom in Asia, basically saved our butt. And this whole notion that Chinese economic success as being hurtful of America is just upside down. It's just nonsense. It's the opposite. Chinese drove prices in the United States down. So even though the government was printing money like crazy, prices didn't increase in the United States because we were importing it from places like China. They buy our debt. Instead of the government getting us to buy the debt and depleting whatever saving we still have, they're depleting the Chinese' savings by having them buy a debt, and the interest they get is minute, and they still keep buying the debt. They invested in the United States. And they encouraged American companies to come over there, and they invested in those companies, which then sent their profits home. So China has been a massive, massive benefit to the United States. Indeed, if not for China, we might have gone the route that Ayn Rand predicted for us in 1974. And again, the fact that Reagan and Thatcher and China and Asia all happened at about the same time is not an accident. It was a change in the thinking globally about economics. a resurrection of at least a little bit of capitalism all over the world that suddenly generated this boom of saving and investment, this boom of production that happened elsewhere. But that is now gone. It is gone because China is moving away from freedom. It is gone because China now is moving towards more consumption. It's gone because China now is bought into Keynesian economics and is encouraging debt financing and consumption and is moving away from saving and investment and production. It is gone now because we have turned away from trade. And indeed, the West generally has turned away from globalization. It's gone because the United States has abandoned all constraints on government spending, on Fed printing money, on bailing out businesses, on cronyism, on distorting money prices, on distorting production, on distorting investments. What the Fed is doing is unbelievably distortive in terms of the importance of prices and the allocation of capital. So we're again in a place where I can only see darkness economically in our future. The only thing that saves us, the only thing that can save us, are the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the creators, the builders, the makers, the big tech evil guys, the people who actually produce still in America. But even they, given the distortion of the pricing signals, given the distortion of money, given the lack of saving and investment in this country, can they save us? Can they do enough? Not sure what, right? So, all of you who love to hate China, I mean, there's lots of reasons to hate China today, but thank China for the last 40 years. We'd be in deep doo-doo if not for China in the last 40 years. And the reason China became what it became is because it turned towards freedom. And one of the reasons China is no longer growing at the pace that it did, producing at the pace that it did, is because it's turning away from freedom. And to the extent that it turns away from freedom, it's not worth worrying about as an enemy. I mean, they've done amazing things for their own people. If you think about 1.4 billion Chinese almost on the verge of starvation and where the Chinese are today, and we should all be thankful because that means 1 billion productive people out there producing, creating, making stuff. And what's sad about China is they turn towards authoritarianism. They turn towards great authoritarianism. They turn towards Keynesian economics. They turn away from what got them to where they are today. We will all suffer from that. And to the extent that Trump and others help that, promote that, encourage that, we're all worse off. All right. Enough. Let's look at some of the questions. We got a bunch of questions here. Todd, thank you. That is very generous. We really appreciate it. All right, some quick reminders. If you enjoyed the show, please like the show. Press the like button. We've got 111 likes on 168 watching live right now. There should be more because I know that a lot more than 168 people have watched the show, at least portions of it. So go in there, right? Look, there's a ton of technicalities we could get into that I'm not going to. There's the supply of money and demand for money. There's a huge amount of confusion about money still out there, but I can't do everything on one show. So don't forget to like the show. Don't forget to share it if you enjoyed it. Also, if you enjoy these kind of shows, show me by using Super Chat to contribute money. Of course, what's really valuable is regular contributions over time. Those are great. Patreon, Subscribestar, yaronbrookshow.com/support. All of those are mechanisms by which you can support the show on a regular basis. So please do so. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and encourage your friends to subscribe. All right, let me start with the $20 questions. We'll start with those first. I think I only have 2 of those. Let me check. That is right. All right. Velocity of M1 is now at the same level as 1960. It has been going down from the high of 2007. Is there some kind of hoarding of money, and what will happen if the hoarding stops? Yes, I mean, there's certainly hoarding. Now, again, M1 is not a great measure. None of these M's are great measures. Some of the Austrians have their own measure of money. I think it's all... We live in a super complex world when it comes to money. Because you have money substitutes, and then you have derivatives on money substitutes, and you also have zero interest rates, which makes a lot of credit the equivalent of money substitutes. So I actually think it's really, really hard, harder than ever right now, because of the sophistication of financial markets and because of zero interest rates. It's more difficult today than ever to actually get a good sense of how much money is out there in circulation. What is the, if you look at the supply and demand of money, what is the supply of money? The whole financial world today, in a sense, makes it really, really hard to get at what the supply of money actually is that will impact financial decisions and would impact, that is inflation, right? So, right, it's very difficult. But yes, there's a lot of hoarding going on in the sense that the big banks, or most banks, have huge quantities of reserves sitting on at the Fed, and they have had since 2009. They've had large reserves at the Fed, partially by regulation, and partially because there's very little loan demand, and because the Fed, in its genius in 2008, started paying them interest to keep their money at the Fed. They never used to pay them interest. So banks have an incentive not to lend the money out and instead to sit on it, as long as it's in accounts at the Fed. So if they stop doing that, and if velocity actually took off, and velocity is how much every dollar, in a sense, changes hands, moves around. And if the dollar changes hands once and then goes into the bank and the bank puts it at the Fed and it's out of circulation, then velocity is very low. But if people are spending it, investing it, and it's moving around, and it's going all over the place, and it's being lent out constantly, that's a high velocity, right? And the banks are lending. And every time, then there's high velocity. If that ever took off, you could easily get hyperinflation in the U.S. What holds back, price inflation, where price inflation goes up. What holds back price inflation is the lack of velocity, Okay. Again, there's a lot of stuff here I haven't covered because we'd be here for hours and hours and hours if I did. Could a market portfolio, stocks, bonds, commodities, etc., replace gold as a backing for money? Banks would hold these assets and back their currency, money, with it. More diversified, better than just gold. Well, no, because a market portfolio I'm for competition, right? So if a bank wanted to try this, they're welcome to do it. But I think their currency would be significantly inferior to gold-backed currency, because that market portfolio would be volatile. It could go up. We just saw markets go down 30% in a month. In a month. That's not good money. Where the underlying assets value is independent. Now, and this is the complexity, right? I have to think this through, right? Because it's complicated, right? So you're issuing money based on a portfolio that's denominated in your money. It just doesn't work. What you want is something that has a value independent of its use as money. A value independent of money. A value in production, ideally. And then its value doesn't change. It doesn't go up or down. Its value stays. What changes is what it can buy, right? So money doesn't have a price. There's no price of money. The value of money is what it can buy, but that's not a price. So money shouldn't have a price. A portfolio has a price, denominated in that which it creates, money. So no, it's too circular. Gold is a brilliant form of money. Again, I don't have any problem with competition. And to see what happens, I just don't think anything can beat gold. And I don't think gold it should be an investment. Gold is not an investment. Gold in an ideal society is money, not an investment. It's how you hold your savings. It's how you denominate your investment. But it is not an investment in and of itself. Right? Adam writes, Yaron and I are both richer from this transaction, and to the extent this is viewed, liked, and shared, we are richer still by living in a world where this information is more broadly consumed. Thank you all. Thank you, Adam, for making this show possible and for encouraging me or motivating me, incentivizing me to do this show. Can you consider hosting Jayet Bandri on your show? He's affiliated with Mises and has a valuable perspective on monetary policy, especially the disastrous monetization in India. If he's affiliated with the Mises Institute in the United States, then no. I mean, if he's a strong affiliation. I won't host anybody who's affiliated with the Mises Institute in the United States, which I view as an abhorrent institution. I don't know much about the demonetization in India. Although anytime you're trying to demonetize an economy, the only reason to do that is to increase the electronic transactions, which you can monitor, tax, control overseas. So it's a way, demonetization is a massive power grab by government. That's its purpose. To get rid of cash is to get rid of the most private ability to do private transactions that the government cannot observe. And it doesn't want you to be able to do private transactions that it cannot observe. So it tries to get rid of cash, and that's its purpose. All right, let's run through these questions now in no particular order because we've done the $20 ones. Given that money is mostly exchanged electronically, do you think it's easier now more than ever to privatize currency? Thank you for all your work. I think it's always easier to privatize currency. I don't think it's the difficulty in privatizing currency is that you have to set a benchmark when you create the currency, and the way to set, and so you have to somehow transition to gold or to an alternative, and then you can create competition, but you have to set some kind of standard, and that transition can be messy, and if you do it wrong, you can create a real shock to the system. Initially, it will all stabilize over time, but initially you can create a shock. So I don't think it's hard to transition. And I think you're probably right that electronic money makes it easier. But the difficulty in privatization was never the economics. The difficulty in privatization is political and knowledge. I mean, it would scare the bejesus out of people, the idea that money is private and that we're getting the government out of it. Nobody Nobody supports that. Right? Nobody's ever supported that. By the way you get to set a topic for a show is by doing what Adam did, which is give Super Chat $1,000, and then you can set the topic of a show in the future, as long as it's reasonable, right? I have to approve it, but basically, as long as it's reasonable, you can do that. So you can contribute $1,000 either through Super Chat or directly to me through PayPal, but paypal.me/Yaron Brook show, and I think it's just /Yaron Brook. And then you can send me an email saying I gave you $1,000 and here's the topic I want to do. So that's the way to achieve that. The other way, somebody today did this, not for a show, but somebody today became a $500 monthly contributor every month, and what they get is 30 minutes one-on-one with me. So if you do $500 a month every month, you get half an hour just one-on-one with me. If you do $250 a month, you get half an hour every 3 months with me. So that's kind of the spectrum of contributions at the high end. Feel free to join at any one of those levels. Given that we're off a gold standard, why do our dollars seem to have an objective value whereas Bitcoins don't? What's the difference? The only difference is that the dollar bill is backed by the U.S. government. That is, the U.S. government is willing to accept the dollars as payment for tax and payment for debts. If you owe money and you want to pay it in dollars, the recipient has to accept those dollars. So it is, the government has determined what gives it value, not objective value, because the value of the dollar is constantly changing, and it's constantly up for grabs what its actually purchasing power is because of the actions of government that is devaluing it and distorting it and so on. But basically, you cannot pay for your taxes with Bitcoin. You cannot pay off your debts with Bitcoin. If the recipient wants dollars, you have to pay with dollars. So, and indeed, Bitcoins are measured in terms of what? In terms of the value in dollars. So, Bitcoin has no value beyond the willingness of people to exchange. The value the dollars have beyond the willingness of people to exchange is that you can pay the government with it. If the government adopted Bitcoin as a mechanism by which to pay taxes, it would anchor Bitcoin. But of course, it wouldn't, and it would never do that. Right? Bitcoin has to be anchored by something, by some value, by some use. And maybe the blockchain will do that ultimately, but I don't know enough to be able to say so. And right now, I believe it's just speculation. If Americans moved towards objectivism and wanted to honor Ayn Rand with her on a dollar bill, which bill would you choose her to be on? Well, I would choose her not to be on any dollar bill because one of the ways in which America would move towards objectivism is to move towards private banks, and private banks would then issue currency, and it wouldn't be the federal government, and different banks might put different people on their bills, and it would be nice if all the banks agreed that on the $100 bill they put Ayn Rand. That's where I'd want her. But it would have to be private decisions by private banks. I don't believe the government has anything to do with currency. Money should be private. What do you think of the theory that other countries will conspire to replace the dollar as the world reserve currency? That's causing the U.S. government to default on its debt and will wreck the economy. I don't see how that theory would work. Because who are these governments that are going to do this? And what are they going to replace the dollar with? The Chinese currency? Does anybody trust China more than the United States in terms of its currency? In terms of its upholding its deals? No. Will they use the euro? Do people trust the European Central Bank and the European Union? No. Are they going to create a new currency? Now, if a bunch of governments got together and went on a gold-backed currency, that would be great. But which government exactly is willing to do that and give up control? Certainly the Chinese are not willing to do it. And the Europeans are not willing to do it. So who's going to do it? That's the question. Russia? what currency is Russia going to replace everything with? So there's just I don't see how in real life this could happen. Now, yes, you could create a fiction and they could go in a gold-backed currency, but no current government today is motivated to do that because then they lose control. Should it be constitutionally prohibited to the government to acquire debt except for constitutionally declared wars? I think that's right. I think the government should never be able to issue debt unless in an emergency, like a war, and then it would have to be delimited in terms of how long the debt, like a 5-year bond or a 10-year bond or something like that. Yes. And then they would have to ask people for contributions to the government to be able to pay off the debt. Or for people to forgive the debt. That would be another way to get rid of the debt, forgiveness. Which I think people would be happy to, particularly if we won the war. When a currency is first introduced into existence, how is it first distributed to banks, businesses, and consumers? Also, what are thoughts on childbirth rates as it relates to GDP growth? When a currency is first introduced, well, it's usually not introduced in a vacuum. It's usually introduced to replace another currency. So usually what the central bank does is it buys the old currency at a given exchange rate. Like in Israel, they issued a new shekel. So every 100 old shekel, you got one new shekel. And the banks, they would basically, the central bank would buy the old shekel from the banks, and the banks would use the new shekel to buy the old shekel from the consumers out there. If it was completely new, if there was no money in a society, then they would do it by, again, and if it was a central bank, they would do it by buying assets, by buying IOUs. But that's never the case because there's always a currency in place. Or they could, let's say everybody was using dollars. Let's say you're Ecuador. In Ecuador today, everybody uses dollars. There's no local currency. And let's say Ecuador wanted to introduce a local currency. Then what the government would do is they'd set an exchange rate between dollars and the new currency. And they would ask people to bring their dollars into the bank and exchange it for the new currency. That's how it would happen. Oh, what are my thoughts on childbirth rates as related to GDP? Well, I mean, the way GDP is calculated, there's no question that a shrinking population reduces GDP because part of GDP is consumption. And consumption decreases as population decreases because there are fewer people to consume stuff. That's why GDP is not a very good number. What you need is a measure of the quality and standard of life, the standard of life, standard of living. And the standard of living could go up when you have fewer children, not down. So I don't like GDP, but I don't know of a better number right now. It's not about China increasing our strength. It's about the relative strength of an authoritarian enemy. I don't think China's an enemy, not an enemy in the sense of a physical threat to the United States. I think it's authoritarian, obviously. I've said what I think, but basically, I think what's important for us is our strength. And if China's increased our strength, my view is that if not for China in the 1980s, our economy would be in shambles. So we wouldn't have an enemy, so-called enemy, in China. But we would be in shambles. We would be poor. There would be shortages in America. There would be lines. There would be shortages of food, potentially. I'd rather take prosperity. And on a relative basis, China become richer. But I don't consider China an enemy unless we make it one. I don't think China has territorial ambitions that include the United States of America. They have territorial ambitions in Asia, but that's Asia's problem, not American problem. So, I don't think we should be worried about the fact that China might want to invade Vietnam. That's China's problem and Vietnam's problem, not America's problem. So I have no problem with China's economy doing better, Chinese consumers saving, and sending that saving to the United States. I think it's good for us. And yes, it's good for China. Trade is win-win. I feel bad for Chinese people who have to live under authoritarianism. But I'm not worried about a war with China unless we instigate it. China is not suicidal. It has no interest in blowing itself to smithereens. There's no interest in going to war with the United States. But some Americans seem stupid enough to want to go to war with China. Well, why should America defend Taiwan? I mean, I think it would be horrible if China invaded Taiwan, but why should America defend Taiwan? We right now have a treaty with Taiwan, so we have to. But I don't know that that treaty makes sense from an American perspective. Right? I don't consider China as it is right now to be the equivalent of the Nazis or even the equivalent of the Japanese imperialists of World War II. I also remember that Ayn Rand did not believe the United States should enter World War II and believed that the United States should continue trading with Japan. And she was against FDR's decision to stop trade with steel with Japan. She thought that was a mistake that led to Pearl Harbor. So I don't think it's clear-cut whether the United States should... I mean, I don't think we should trade with Nazi Germany. I don't think we should trade with Soviet Union. But I don't think China is Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. They haven't invaded anybody yet. They treat their citizens like really, really badly, and that's horrible. But they do not qualify yet as an enemy of the United States. They're not out there trying to kill us. They're not taking our land. They're not invading. They haven't attacked Pearl Harbor. They're not an enemy of the United States. And if individual Americans want to trade with China, they should. Now, you could make the argument that it's immoral to trade with them because of how they treat their own citizens. But that's fine. That's not the business of the U.S. government. And I did send, China has concentration camps. There's no question. Again, it's still a voluntary decision of individuals whether to trade or not. Not the job of government to decide. Now, I don't think the United States should have an embassy in China. I don't think the United States should have diplomatic relations with China. Not because China is an enemy, but because China is a not respecting of rights. I don't think Nixon should have gone to China. But trade is something completely different. Trade is something individuals do. Trade is not the business of government unless a country is declared an enemy. And when you declare a country an enemy, you're ready to go to war with them. And I can only think of two countries that are enemies of the United States today. Enemies. That is Iran and North Korea. That's it. I don't think Russia's an enemy. It's not a friendly nation, and we shouldn't have diplomatic relationship with them, but they're not an enemy. And I don't think China's an enemy. And by the way, the U.S. military would crush both of those if allowed to do so. And yes, I mean, what are we supposed to do with Hong Kong? Go to war with China over Hong Kong? Really? Would we go to war with Russia over Estonia? I mean, China, you as an individual should consider whether you want to trade with China because of what they did in Hong Kong, what they're doing in Hong Kong. But again, that's not the job of the U.S. government. And this is why we shouldn't have diplomatic relations with China. We shouldn't have diplomatic relations with China because we shouldn't sanction the regime in China because of what it's doing in Hong Kong. But tariffs are a joke, and not recognizing the economic benefits we have received from China is economically ignorant. And wanting to go to war with China is insanity. The only reason Ayn Rand advocated for embargoing the Soviet Union, not Russia, the Soviet Union, was because the Soviet Union was an enemy. But she didn't believe in embargoing China, funnily enough. She didn't believe in embargoing China because she didn't view China as an enemy. Both were communists. At the time, it was Mao Zedong's China, real communism. So Ayn Rand believed in embargoing the Soviet Union because it was an enemy, not because it was communist, but because it was an enemy, and not embargoing China because it wasn't an enemy, even though it was communist. If it's a threat, then you have to define what kind of a threat. Is it a threat to the individual rights of Americans? Is it a threat, a physical threat, a military threat? And if it is, then take action as if it's a threat. I don't believe China is planning war with the United States. I don't believe China is going to take American territory. I don't believe China is getting ready to invade Hawaii. If I did, then yeah, embargo them and start arming up. I don't believe we should embargo Cuba. Cuba's not a threat to the United States. It's not an enemy. Again, big difference between an enemy and an immoral country. China's an immoral country. What they're doing with the concentration camps, what they're doing with Hong Kong is clearly immoral. And you as an individual should consider not trading with them. But that does not mean the U.S. government should do something. No, Cuba's not wonderful. Cuba's a communist dictatorship, and I will not trade with Cuba. Because in Cuba, every dollar of stuff you buy from Cuba, every Cuban cigar you buy goes straight to the government, the money. In China, that's not true. When you buy some product that was made in China, that money actually goes to the person who made the product and makes their life better off. The government doesn't siphon anywhere close to 100%, less actually than what it siphons in the United States. What if China is a threat to an ally of the United States? Then we have to define what an ally is. Do we have a defense treaty with them? What exactly is the nature of our relationship with that ally? You see, what the United States has to do is have a foreign policy. We do not have a foreign policy today. We do not define countries as allies. We do not have a clear definition of treaties. We do not have a foreign policy, not under any president since World War II. And in World War II, it was a pretty shitty foreign policy under FDR. So all of these questions are legitimate questions and good questions. But first you have to get to the point where you have a foreign policy, where you've defined allies, where you have treaties, where you explicitly state what you're willing to do in those treaties and not do in those treaties, and where you withdraw sanction from evil regimes like China. Remember, I believe we should not have an embassy in China. We should have no diplomatic relations with China. We should have no trade deal with China. We should just have zero tariffs with China and let American individuals decide whether they want to trade or not. That's it. And if I think that China's building up a navy and it's a threat, then I'd build up my navy even faster. And not to recognize the benefits the United States has received from China is just insane. It's just evading reality. It's ignoring the fact. It's placing a wish above a reality. It's not a matter, and to not recognize that 1 billion Chinese have come out of poverty and not view that as a positive thing, and not view the fact that Chinese are not starving as a positive thing, is inhumane. It means you don't care, literally don't care, about hundreds of millions of people's lives. And the fact that hundreds of millions of Chinese are producers today, producers, making stuff, building stuff, creating stuff, is insane. It means you don't value human life, and you don't value human production, and you don't value human ability. So they have a standing army. Why is that a threat to you? Hey, I come from Israel, where we had standing armies all surrounding us. Stop being so chicken. Americans are so pathetically cowards. You really afraid of China? Give me a break. So, no, I think Americans' obsession with China is absurd, ridiculous. I think the idea of turning China into an enemy is absurd and ridiculous. There are ways in which we could, the most important thing the United States could do to eliminate China from being an enemy of the United States is be capitalist, is be proud, is advocate for freedom. Because if we advocate for freedom, if we become a shining city on the hill, if we present a real alternative to China, then the Chinese people will overthrow their government. But when we're pathetic, cowardly, whiny, mixed economy, welfare state, afraid of immigrants, afraid of Chinese, afraid of imports, afraid of competition, then yeah, nobody's going to want to mimic us. Nobody doesn't want to be like us. And people are going to say, yeah, the Chinese model, that makes sense. And even the Chinese themselves are going to say, yeah, that pathetic America, who wants to be like them? We'd rather be what we have. So the only way to achieve freedom in the world, The only way to reduce the enemies in the world is to achieve freedom in the United States of America. Stop obsessing about enemies that don't exist, about risks that are not there. Nationalistic protection is a sign of weakness. It's a sign of inferiority. It's a sign of fear. It's a sign of not having confidence in your own ability. Nothing emboldens the enemy. Nothing emboldens the enemy more than your weakness. Building walls, hunkering behind walls, hunkering behind tariffs, hunkering, shutting down your economy because of a virus. We're pathetic. And you want to project our pathetic, you want to blame the fact that we're pathetic on the Chinese? That just makes you more pathetic. A sound currency has to be backed with an asset that is accepted as valuable, else no one would use it. There is an error in my thinking. Isn't that what our current fiat currency is? Countries around the world love the US dollar. They love the US dollar because there's nothing else. See, there's a law in economics, and it's, oh my God. I hate this. Names, just, I can't retain them. Bad money drives out good money. Bad money drives out good money. So even if governments could use the gold, they won't. They'll hold the gold and use dollars. But the dollar is the best among a lot of, Gresham's law, thank you, a lot of bad currencies. So the dollar looks good compared to the euro, compared to the yuan, compared to the, I don't know, the Turkish lira, which is collapsing right now. The only reason countries around the world love the dollar is because it's the best of a lot of lousy currencies. And they will not like the dollar if suddenly prices go up and they can buy less and less with the dollar. So far, the Federal Reserve has managed to keep interest rates low, and yet people still buy the dollar because it's the best alternative. Inflation, in terms of prices, has not increased. That's a magic trick that at some point they will not be able to pull off. And at that point, people want to dump the dollar. They want to get rid of the dollar. But for now, it's better than anything else that's out there. Do you think the US dollar going down creates more opportunities for foreign currencies? Since our allies are being invaded, do we have an obligation? What about China creating a new Silk Road across the ocean through ports? So, do I think the US dollar going down creates an opportunity for foreign currencies? No, not really, because it's going down the short run. What do people think about the long run? And if people so convinced the dollar is useless and that there's an alternative that they're willing to dump it, I just don't see it. Maybe it'll happen, but I just don't see it. I don't see what they turn to instead. What do they turn to instead? Gold? Statist governments in Europe? So I don't get that. Since our allies are being invaded, do we have an obligation? I don't think so. I don't believe we just jump and defend our allies. It depends on the relationship we have with the allies. We didn't jump to defend England when England was under attack by the Nazis. I don't believe we should go and send American troops to defend Israel, even though Israel's an ally. I don't believe we should be part of NATO today. I think we should withdraw from NATO, and we should not commit to defending Europe. Europe can defend itself. They're rich enough. Why should we send American kids to die for Europe? So, you'd have to have a foreign policy in which we define who our allies are, what our commitments to them, under what conditions, under what circumstances. You'd have to really sit down and think, what does the protection of American individual rights really mean? Remember, the only job of government is the protection of the individual rights of Americans. So then the question is, what does that necessitate? What kind of treaties? What kind of relationship with allies? Do we defend all allies? Under what circumstances? When? A lot of thinking has to go into that. What about China creating a new Silk Road across the ocean through ports? Amazing, wonderful. I mean, the thing that I worry about is not the ports. It's not trade. Trade is wonderful. The more trade, the better. What I worry about is that they're exporting their ideology and they're exporting their system of government. And that's the trouble. And the only reason they can export their government, their ideology, and their system of government is so we are so weak. We are no longer present ourselves as the model for new countries. And China's filling a vacuum that we have created because we are not capitalist anymore. We are not free anymore. We are just another mixed economy in the world out there. And both Obama and Trump are the anti-American exceptionalism presidents. How do you answer AOC's, well, no, let's see. It's not about China increasing our strength. Oh, we did that already. Some are why the Chinese film companies are instilling pro-China values through Hollywood. Is that a valid concern? Yes, it's definitely a valid concern. But what do you do about it? When the Soviet Union was doing it in Hollywood, we did nothing about it. I mean, what are you going to do about it? Start your own Hollywood. I mean, you ban Chinese money from entering Hollywood. You ban Hollywood from selling their movies in China. What do you do about it? It's a concern. It should be written about. We should shame Hollywood. We should boycott some of their movies if there's a Chinese influence on them. We should do what we can. But at the end of the day, we are a free market, and we don't have the government intervene in what movies get made and what movies don't get made. Any financial advice for young people looking to start their careers in this economy? Is our only hope to change the culture? Well, the financial advice for you is get a job, work hard, save. It doesn't change. Even if the world goes to hell, you'll still have to work hard, and you'll have to save money. And that would be my advice. Work hard. You won't, and it's going to be harder and harder to make money. It's going to be harder and harder to save. I mean, think of how Fed policy screws savers because interest rates are so low. No, Ayn Rand never advocated for communists to be arrested. She advocated for members of the Communist Party. A party that was advocating for the overthrow of the American government to be arrested. But if you were just ideologically a communist, then no. She testified in the HUAC hearings, but she never advocated for communists to be arrested. I mean, that would be horrible if you start arresting people based on their ideology when you're not at war. There's no war going on right now. Is our only hope to change the culture? Yes. Now, the change doesn't have to be true objectivism. Just a greater respect for production, a greater respect for entrepreneurship, a greater respect for basic American values would go a long way to improving the world in which we live, even if you don't go all the way to objectivism. Would blockchain backed by gold? Well, yeah. I mean, cryptocurrency backed by gold, I think, would be perfect. You can't make Bitcoin backed by gold because Bitcoin is mined through this process. I don't know about Ethereum, but you could create a cryptocurrency that was backed by gold. And I think that would be what would win in the end. But that's not Bitcoin. How do you answer AOC's billionaires should not exist in a model society? I did a whole video on it, so go back and find it. Thank you, Corey. You can go back and find it. It's basically, who are you to say who should exist and who shouldn't exist in a free society? In a free society, anybody who should exist who doesn't hurt other people, who doesn't violate the rights of other people. And if you trading and you producing and you creating nets you billions of dollars, then yay for you. You should be celebrated. You should be thanked because you have made the world a better place by doing that. So it's exact opposite. We want a world in which there are lots of billionaires. But, you'd have to listen to my whole spiel on it and just look up billionaires Yaron Brook or AOC Yaron. I've talked about it many times. You just mentioned the trick the Fed has been using to keep inflation low. Can you expand upon that? this is clarifying, I think, on the confusing topic. I mean, there's a lot going on, and I don't have time because we're running out of time. But one is paying banks to keep reserves at the Fed keeps money out of circulation. B, just having a depressed economy, having a low confidence of investors and not investors in the market, but of entrepreneurs to grow and to build businesses. There's less demand for loans. And finding ways, and I don't know how the Fed does this exactly, of funneling the money that it creates into financial assets rather than into the broad economy. So the stock market goes up, and a lot of money goes into the stock market and into the bond market and generates zero interest rates. But that money somehow doesn't reach the real economy, and I think part of why it doesn't reach the real economy is because it gets stuck inside the banking system, and the velocity of money is reduced dramatically. The number of times a dollar is used, in a sense. All right, Corey, this is the last question. In a free society, when would one become a citizen of a free country? In other words, when would one be justified for a country to go out of its way to defend an individual who is not a native and their rights are violated by a foreign power? That's a great question. I talked about it in the past. This is a controversial theory. I don't know that other objectivists support this. I don't know what Ayn Rand would have thought of this. She never spoke about this. This is me. This is not objectivism. It's not me interpreting Ayn Rand because it's me extending what I think is the logic. I think to become a citizen, you would need to do a few things. One, I think you would need to, the main thing is, let's just focus on one thing. You would need to pass a test. And I think this is true of people born in the United States and immigrants. You would have to pass a test, and the test would be a hard test. It would be a test that basically required a deep understanding of the American system of government. Not of the philosophy on which it's based necessarily, but of how the system works and what it does. And you'd have to know. So, and this would be a requirement for voting, right? So the advantage citizens have over non-citizens is they get to vote. And, as Corey says, their rights are protected in a broader scope. For example, violated by foreign powers. Right? So you would have to show that you really understood the American system of government. And then you would become a citizen. So I would say something like you'd have to have lived in the United States 18 years. So if you were born in the U.S. and lived here 18 years, you could take the test at 18 and become a citizen. Or if you immigrated to the United States, you'd have to live here for 18 years, and then you could take a test and become a citizen. But it would require that deep understanding. And it would be a hard test. It wouldn't be like the tests they are today. And then at that point, you would be considered a citizen. You could vote, and the government would then protect you from foreign powers. Whereas if you just lived in the United States and worked in the United States, the government would protect all your rights, but it wouldn't protect you, in a sense, outside of the borders. It wouldn't protect you from foreign powers, for example. Something like that. But again, a lot more thinking has to be put in that. You'd have to figure out exactly what all that means and what the test would look like and what does it mean to protect your rights against violation of a foreign power, and in what context, and when do you go to war and when don't. None of this is easy. I deal with it on a pretty broad abstraction, but to actually turn it into, this into politics, into something that's being applied, there's a lot of thinking and a lot of detail that legal philosophers would have to go through, and foreign policy experts would have to go through. And let me just say, nothing I said today was objectivism. Everything I said today was Yaron Brook, his best understanding of objectivism, and his interpretation of objectivism. And it's nothing I said today Ayn Rand said. I applied Ayn Rand's ideas and things she said in the 70s to today. I don't know if she'd apply them in the same way. She probably wouldn't. Anyway. All right. Thanks, guys. Don't forget before you leave to like the show. Don't forget to share it if you enjoyed it and you think other people might benefit from it. And please, for those of you who get value out of the show, not just out of arguing on the chat, but actually value from what I say, whether you agree with it or not, please contribute to the show, whether on yaronbrookshows.com/support or on PayPal or here on the Super Chat or on Facebook or on, Subscribe Store or Patreon or Locals. All right, and of course, subscribe. And if you click the bell next to the subscription button, then you'll find out when there's a live show going on. And finally, since I see it's an issue over there, nothing Derek says is me, represents me, for whatever that's worth. I don't know what the context is. As Derek himself says, nothing I say is Yaron Brook. Only I speak for me. Until further notice. All right. Thanks, everybody. And I will see you all on Tuesday. Tuesday, 8 p.m. East Coast time. Tuesday, 8 p.m. East Coast time. See you then. Bye, everybody.